So yesterday, or Tuesday, depending on when you're watching this, was a very interesting day in this country. As you know, the end of September is dedicated for the Truth and Reconciliation Day, which is a day to honor and reflect on the survivors of those indigenous people that were taken and kidnapped, put into residential schools, the mass graves scandal that came about. It was kind of in honor to that. We have saw, Justin Trudeau put that into action, but of course, the federal response was very lacking on this subject matter, considering that Justin Trudeau went off jet skiing on a day that's supposed to be about reflection, supposed to be about, looking at the darkness of our history here in this country, which if you look at any country, there's going to be darkness, there's going to be evil, there's going to be wrongdoings, and we need to learn from those experiences. We need to take in, the faults that we have done in our society and try to understand why it was wrong, why we did what we did, and try not to repeat those mistakes. But it just seems like Truth and Reconciliation Day, that's supposed to be about reflecting on that horror, has become a bit of a marketing gimmick. And I'm about to explain that here in a bit. But just to highlight this, so this is from APTN News. Now, for those who aren't aware, who aren't Canadian, APTN is the television network dedicated to Aboriginal people. And it's a cable outlet. It was designed and purposely to share and incentivize, indigenous culture and spirit, and through its television channel and its programming. And they tweeted this out. So today, so meaning yesterday, is National Day for Truth and Reconciliation Day, also known as Orange Shirt Day, at a time to raise awareness for the ongoing impacts of residential schools and remember the children who never came home. And understand that was a significant part of our history. That is horrific when you hear the stories, when you understand that part of Canadian identity and historically just how awful and degrading it is. It's a moment to reflect on that. But this is where it gets a little bit heated in the controversy. So Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, also chimed in on this to say, on this day for truth and reconciliation, we reflect on the tragic legacy and ongoing impacts of the residential school system and honor the survivors and their communities. Together, we will continue to build a Canada guided by truth, justice, and reconciliation. Kind of interesting that that's not the case for the policies implemented by Mark Carney, but he says the right words. He says the right words, but it doesn't come to action when in regard to this. And all the other big politicians also mention about this. So here's Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, Mr. Dunce himself. Here's this little video here. Today is the day to remember the survivors of residential schools, their families and their children who never came home. Ontario stands with Indigenous communities as we continue working towards truth and reconciliation. So he puts this video out here. And I get that he's the premier. He has the production value. He has the ability to, make it look glamorous, this message that he's delivering. But I had to take a second look at this because I almost thought this was AI generated. And I want people to take a look at this too and decide for yourself whether or not he's actually sincereful, or if maybe this was some sort of AI generation, or if it was a PR stunt. But take a look at this.
We come together to recognize the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and Orange Shirt Day. This day honors the survivors of residential schools, their families, and the children who never came home. It's a time to reflect on the lasting impacts of these institutions and to acknowledge the truth of our shared history. Today is a powerful reminder of the importance of standing in solidarity with our Indigenous communities across the country. Let us take this day to remember, to learn, and to move forward together. Thank you. Today.
So It sounds sincere. It sounds sincere. But was the emotional empathy, like, it's that message, is that going to guide Doug Ford and Mark Carney and these people that are stating this? Is this going to guide them towards sustainable action to incorporate indigenous problems with the rest of the crisis that's happening in this country? Are you going to, understand that there's still a lot of, communities out there, indigenous communities, that are in dire need and have substantial consequences and problems that are impacted by heinous policies by Doug Ford, by Mark Carney, by so many other premiers that are also saying the exact same message, that they want to, reach out to the indigenous community. The same, it just seems like the same way they do with Pride Month, that, oh, we're going to take the time to reflect on LGBTQ people, but you don't actually do policies that reflect that community as well as the other Canadians. You're not willing to reach out to incorporate them as one whole society. You're trying to kind of divide people and say, you're going to reach out for these people on this day, you're going to reach out for these people on this month and this time, and so on and so forth, without actually doing substantial action. And that's what makes this kind of so controversial, is that, everyone's in lockstep to understand that it was a horrific point in our Canadian history, and that we should be reflecting, we should be honoring, we should be mourning the people that, were afflicted by the residential school system. But in this time, in 2025, concerning that Indigenous people also have substantial problems outside of just reflecting on residential schools, Doug Ford, Mark Carney, and the people that have the authority to do something are completely dismissive about it. But they go on cue, they go on camera on this day, the last day in September, and wear their orange shirts, or in this case, an orange tie, and tell you to reflect on Indigenous tragedies. Well, we're witnessing some tragedies right now that aren't being presented, that aren't being said about. So what does this mean? Is this just a PR gimmick? Is this just for federal politicians and provincial politicians to look like they have empathy? A coordinated effort? Well, here's Sean Fraser, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. I had to look that up because I forgot exactly who he was. Today, we remember the children who never came home from residential schools, their families, and those who survived the horrors of the system. Here's Pierre Poilievre. Today, on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, MP Ellis Ross and I had the honor and privilege of sitting together and participating in a pipe ceremony with Ashkenekbek Nation's Grand Council Chief Linda Despagie, head Gutster. How do you say these things? I'm sorry. Together, we honored residential school survivors and discussed paths toward true reconciliation, restoring inherent decision-making to Indigenous people over their own lives, which would have always been theirs, and healing historical wrongs by unleashing opportunities for all Indigenous peoples as true partners in prosperity. So, that to me is a little more promising than what Mark Carney said and what even Doug Ford stated, because those two are just saying, hey, you just got to reflect. But this sounds like an actual call to action, which I respect a bit more of Pierre Poilievre making that statement than Mark Carney or Doug Ford or Sean Fraser. Here's Jagmeet Singh, the disgraced NDP leader who lost his own election. Today, on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I want to reflect on the stories I've heard over the years. I remember having 3 generations of women at a healing ceremony in Thunder Bay. Grandmother shared her story as a survivor. She spoke about the shame and guilt she was made for being Indigenous, and goes on and on. Today, I remember the atrocities committed by residential schools and recommitted myself to pursuit of truth and reconciliation. So, again, it just seems like an empty gesture. Like, Pierre Polyev at least has a bit of call to action. And I'm not saying that, Pierre Polyev is magically different than any other politician, but at least I feel a little bit more. There's a bit more empathy coming out of Pierre Polyev than even Jagmeet Singh, who's giving you a detailed list about stories he's heard, but it doesn't mean there's a call to action. He's just saying that, well, we got to reflect on truth and reconciliation. Well, how do you do that? How do you do that, Jagmeet? How do you do that, Mark Carney? How do you do that, Doug Ford? What's your call to action on this? So, this is where people look at this and they get conflated with supporting Orange Shirt Day and Truth and Reconciliation Day. Not because they disagree or they're against understanding the history of residential schools. They understand that, they know that that's a part of our darkness, of our culture and our society. But they're pointing out there's a lot of flaws to this. So this guy, John Paul Berg, he states, this is what he says: "This Reconciliation Orange Day nonsense is a modern-day struggle session for Canadians of European descent. Firstly, the residential schools were deplorable. They were always presented as such. They are a stain on Canada and the Catholic Church." So he's recognizing that the residential school system was awful. I think everyone can agree with that. Everyone can agree that the residential school crisis in this country is an open stain in our history. I think people can see that clearly. This is where it gets controversial. He says, however, this contemporary reinterpretation of this as a genocide is utterly fatuous and predicted on sensational claims that have not been proven. No bodies were found despite millions spent. This generation is picking off healed scabs and squeezing as much blood out as possible. All this serves is to further divide Canadians. We are Canadian, or we are Canada, or are we the traditional hunting grounds of whatever First Nation tribes inhabited a particular geographical part of the country hundreds of years ago? These are mutually exclusive positions. So he does make a point. He's not discriminating the part of reflecting about how horrific the residential school system is, but he's stating the fact that people calling this a genocide, which is kind of amazing. People say this in 2025 as we're witnessing a current genocide in Gaza, that people are going to say that about the residential school system, and how politicians are kind of using this to bait people into a certain direction that's going to further divide Canada. It's not bringing people together. It's actually further dividing people. It's making it divisive. And as he stated there, he says no bodies were found despite millions spent. So as Truth and Reconciliation Day became a thing in Canada, the Canadian government under Justin Trudeau authorized millions of dollars of taxpayer money to be spent excavating residential school areas to find these mass graves. And that was many years ago. That was in 2021, I think that happened, or maybe even earlier than that. I don't know the exact time frame of it. But we've had years. We've had years to excavate and dig into these residential school areas where they believed there was mass amounts of body remains of Indigenous children that they were going to dig up, that they were going to retrieve, and there was going to be some, closure to the residential school crisis, and all this money being spent, and we haven't really heard any updates on this. I've not heard a word about this, but they still go on with this message, and they call it a genocide, which is not. I can't really claim it as a genocide when when really right now we're witnessing a genocide. It seems crazy, right? It seems crazy to call that a genocide when we're witnessing one in real action that's, I would say, far more devastating, far more consequential. You know, it's like how the LGBTQ calls their problems a genocide. It kind of gets overused for the purpose of deteriorating what that word actually means. So that's a very interesting take. I could see where the controversy comes from. Here's Maxime Bernier. So the People's Party leader calls residential schools genocide a hoax on Truth and Reconciliation Day. So Maxime Bernier is also agreeing with that. That saying this is a genocide is purposely false. And I kind of have to agree with it. And it's kind of interesting that people will use that term for this. At the same time, we're witnessing a legit, real ethnic cleansing, a genocide with our taxpayer dollars in Gaza. Just absolutely insane. Here's this guy, Bruce, that points to this New York Post article, 4 years and not a single bone found to date. And the New York Post has this article where it says no human remains found 2 years after claims of mass graves in Canada. So that was from August of 2023. Now we're in 2025. And still no update on this. We've had since 2021. So 4 years. And we haven't had a single update on whether or not they found mass graves, children's bodies. You know, they brought in machinery. They spent millions and millions of dollars, archaeologists and experts to scavenge the areas that they claim may have the bodies. Nothing. We have not heard a single word about it. Here's the Fraser Institute even pointed this out. They said no evidence of mass graves or genocide in residential schools. That's from the Fraser Institute saying this. That they conclude that there's no mass graves. That 4 years have gone by. We've wasted taxpayer money to bring in excavation equipment to dig up the grounds near residential schools where they claim there's mass graves, and they haven't found anything. There's no updates. Nothing. But yet, we are being told and being falsely lied to that this is a horrific genocide. That the residential school system, as awful as it was, again, it's not to discredit the fact that residential schools existed. We know that they existed. We know how awful it was, how they kidnapped people into this, horrific program done by the Canadian government and done by the Catholic Church. It's not trying to, make that into a farce. But this idea to call it a genocide, again, as we're witnessing one in real action in Gaza, and to spend taxpayer money, the millions being spent to dig up graves that we haven't heard a word in over 4 years about. Just seems kind of crazy. And it even got international attention because Matt Walsh even pointed this out. So this is tweeted out by J Gen Xer, who says mass graves, not one body, not an ounce of proof. Don't forget Trudeau went surfing. Yes. Justin Trudeau, who made Truth and Reconciliation Day a national day of reflection, did not reflect. Go figure. He made his own personal vacation day. And here's Matt Walsh to tell his take of it on the fact that after all this time, we still have any evidence to conclude that there was mass graves. So here's what he says here.
They have said again and again that unmarked mass graves had been found at Canada's residential schools, which were boarding schools for Indian children that existed for about 100 years, peaking in the early 20th century. And the discovery of these unmarked mass graves was significant, Canadians were told, because Christian churches were running these residential schools.
Last year, archaeologists detected what they said could be 200 unmarked graves at this former school in Kamloops, British Columbia. Weeks later, a further 751 unmarked graves were detected across from the former Marival Residential School on the Cowessess Reserve in Saskatchewan.
So even with that report, I'm a little skeptical, even with 60 Minutes reporting that archaeologists are detecting that there's unmarked graves. They're detecting. That doesn't mean they have proof. That doesn't mean they have the evidence to say that there's unmarked graves. They're just detecting. There's a sense that there might be unmarked graves within this area. Well, that's not conclusive evidence to claim that case. You could say that there's a hunch that there could be unmarked graves near a residential school. That kind of makes sense considering residential schools at that location. But that doesn't prove that there are unmarked graves, that this is a genocide of Indigenous Canadians. This doesn't prove the case. If you're making the assumption that we detect that there's unmarked graves, that doesn't mean that there actually is remains. And considering now that we're into 2025, this is back in 2021, and we still don't have evidence. We still don't have proof. No documentation. Even the Fraser Institute is saying that there was no unmarked graves.
More than 3 years later, not a single body has been found in any unmarked grave at any residential school anywhere in Canada. Turns out that, in fact, the alleged unmarked grave site in Kamloops was in reality a 2,000-foot-long, 3-foot-deep trench that was established in 1924 as a septic field to store sewage from the school.
So I kind of have to agree with Matt Walsh on this, in the fact that, you had the assumption, you don't really have conclusive evidence to back the argument and why you need to dig up the property to find these unmarked graves. And now here we are 4 years later. This is from last year, but now here we are 4 years later, and we don't have a word, not a single, outcome, not a single mention on news media, nothing. Nothing's been addressed. But you took millions of dollars of taxpayer money to facilitate digging up this property based on an assumption, based on a hunch. Just kind of seems really crazy. Really, really crazy. And this guy points out, this is Pascal Engelhardt. He says, since it's Truth and Reconciliation Day, are we also allowed to tell the truth about those blank, I can't say the word on YouTube, who set all of our churches on fire? I mean, honestly, if we're going to have a Truth and Reconciliation Day, can we also mention the truth about how the Canadian government lied against the truckers in the Freedom Convoy? Is that part of the truth? If we're going to have a conversation about real truth and real reconciliation to heal the country, to heal Canadians in our harshness and our harsh realities, the deception of our history, should we not also include that? Should we not also include the fact that a lot of Indigenous communities still don't have available to drinking water? Can we bring that to the conversation? How about that Canada harbored a bunch of Nazis, war criminals, into our country for many, many years, and one was applauded in Parliament twice. Can we say that as part of Truth and Reconciliation? That, hey, we have a bunch of neo-Nazis in this country, as we're claiming to help Jewish people by funneling a bunch of money to neo-Nazis. Can we talk about that? Can we talk about the Canadian government is facilitating money to create terror abroad so that we send our troops into harm's way? Can we talk about that truth and reconciliation? Like, it's amazing that they call it that day. And there's so much truth. There's so much that needs to be revealed. There's so much we've been lied to year after year after year. But it's just a small little thing, a small little portion that we're only allowed to focus on. We're only allowed to focus on the fact that residential schools exist, which again, it's not to deteriorate. It's not to diminish that or object to that. That is a part of our history. And we as Canadians reflect on that. But we also need to reflect the other stances of our history. We need to understand that even right now in our current affairs, we're constantly being lied to. And if we really want to represent truth and reconciliation to what the title of that day really means, then we should be holding account to our politicians, not letting our politicians dictate how we're supposed to be emotional and reflect. Just saying. Just saying. It kind of it really is a marketing ploy. It's like how, you look in America, Joe Biden, the president of the United States at the time, Joe Biden, made Juneteenth a holiday. The guy who manufactured the 1994 racist crime bill for mass incarceration, the people that told black kids that they're super predators, that he didn't want a racial jungle for his kids. He didn't care if black kids were not socialized or incorporated in part of white society. He didn't care about. He was for segregation. Joe Biden, the guy who manufactured the mass incarceration bill in 1994, then goes on to become president, who still makes racist remarks. We've seen the radio morning show debacle. If you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Like, who the hell says that? Joe Biden then creates Juneteenth to reflect on slavery. Like, that's the absurdity that comes with these kind of days. That if we're really going to reflect on truth and reconciliation and really propose on actions so that we don't have residential schools, we don't discriminate, then we really need to understand that a day like this is not going to help. That this is a marketing ploy. This is a gimmick for politicians to make them feel empathetic to a situation that they would still continue on if they had the power. They would still continue on. And considering there's a lot of crises happening right now involving all Canadians, nothing's being done about that. So maybe we should feel empathetic about that. Maybe feel empathetic that the economy is crushing everybody, regardless of race, regardless of creed, regardless if you're Indigenous or European or whatever the case may be, sexual orientation. Why aren't we talking about that? That this country is falling apart for all Canadians, and it's because of the nefarious schools that look down on you and tell you to participate in this day. Just saying. So, I added this on because I could not believe that Tim Hortons, again, we got to go back to Tim Hortons, shock, surprise. Tim Hortons used this day of reflection and understanding Indigenous, crises and the problems with residents. They used it as a marketing gimmick for donuts. And here I said, Tim Hortons is profiting off Truth and Reconciliation Day with trauma donuts. I kid you not. There's the picture. Native trauma donuts, $2. And it's literally just it looks like a regular glazed donut with orange sprinkles. So they're profiting off a day we're supposed to be reflecting. We're supposed to be self-identifying. We're supposed to be soul-searching. We're supposed to be an emotional wreck to understand what Indigenous people went through. But Tim Hortons is selling freaking donuts and calling them trauma donuts. Oh, how hilarious. And I said, so just to remind people, 0 updates on the search of remains, federal government gets a day off, and Tim slaps some orange sprinkles on a donut while indigenous communities still don't have clean drinking water. And that's true. That's true. There's a lot of indigenous communities across Canada that still don't have functioning drinking water. When is that part of the conversation of Truth and Reconciliation Day? Oh, they're not in residential schools anymore. Okay, that's good. Now give them damn drinking water. I thought you cared about them. I thought you cared them all. I thought you wanted to sit and understand their pain and suffering. Or is that a joke? Or is that just a PR stunt to trick us? That is the most disrespectful portion of this. I know people are going to say that I'm being disrespectful for not, falling into line and not engaging hard enough on this and, criticizing a bit of it. But, this has got to be disgusting. Tim Hortons, native trauma donuts. Using it as a marketing gimmick to sell crappy donuts at a time we're supposed to be reflecting. Unbelievable. I don't know what's more offensive, that or when someone actually does a little investigating and just reminds people that, hey, your taxpayer money got wasted to look for unmarked graves, and we haven't heard a word since. And that's not just right-wing talk. That's institution. So many people have commented on this, including myself. So that's why Truth and Reconciliation Day just seems like I get the point. Don't get me wrong. I get the point of understanding residential schools. I get the point that is a dark part of our history and needs to be understood. We need to learn from our mistakes. We need to teach people that was wrong. Obviously, that goes without saying. But to use this as a gimmick for politicians to get a day off or to, make sob stories without any call to action, or for Tim Hortons to make it a business advertisement, is absolutely deplorable, absolutely disgusting, and far more greater abuse of the day than criticizing the mass grave scandal. It's just awful. So maybe this Truth and Reconciliation Week, even though it's a day, but maybe this week, people should examine how this day of self-reflection and understanding the pains and sorrows of Indigenous people are being abused by powerful entities that still abuse Indigenous people. Maybe take some time to understand that and realize why this is such a joke, why Juneteenth is such a joke, and why all this is virtue signaling that does nothing for actual people, and it's done purposely to bait people into fake sympathy, fake sorrows, and do nothing in return. And it makes me absolutely just disheartened, disgusted, and pissed off that politicians will take advantage of this. It's so unbelievably disgusting.